If wrestling had a Mr. Nice Guy award, Mean Gene Okerlund would have won it every year. Or at least until someone tested his patience. This guy was the gold standard for professionalism. Smooth voice, razor-sharp wit, and a knack for making even the wildest lunatics sound like they just spilled their coffee. But don't let that calm exterior fool you. Backstage, Mean Gene wasn't some doormat in a bow tie. No, he had a list. A quietly burning, simmering professional irritation list of people who made him question if his career choice was a mistake or just an elaborate prank. From mouthy hotheads to self-serving backstabbers, Gene's locker room life was a slow roast of frustration, sprinkled with enough dry wit to make a desert jealous. This video isn't a love letter. It's a scorched earth expose on the folks who pushed the man everyone trusted just a bit too far. Strap in, because beneath that polished mic was a man who knew exactly who was worth his time, and who wasn't even worth a grunt. Welcome to the backstage heat no one dared say out loud. Welcome to Mean Gene's real wrestling world. Mean Gene's WCW hotline wasn't just a number. It was a frontline battlefield where old school polish met loudmouthed sarcasm, and that's putting it mildly. Mark Madden, the hockey-crazed commentator with a mouth faster than a speeding bullet, was Gene's opposite in every way possible. Where Gene brought gravitas and professionalism, Madden brought teenage-level sass and an endless supply of snark. Their chemistry? About as smooth as sandpaper in a blender. Madden openly mocked Gene's age and accused him of spinning sensationalistic teasers to hype the hotline, stuff Gene took personally because, well, Gene was good at his job. Gene's frustration wasn't just about Madden's insults, it was about the constant undermining of his reputation and the subtle digs that piled up backstage like dirty laundry. Mark Madden treating Gene like an outdated ringtone was the wrestling equivalent of bringing a kazoo to a rock concert. Loud, annoying, and no one's quite sure why you're still here. In multiple RF video shoots and insider reports, their backstage beef wasn't kayfabe, it was real, simmering tension. Gene's old-school dignity clashed head-on with Madden's brash style, and neither was willing to back down. The result? A backstage grudge match with no finish, just a constant stream of low blows and cutting remarks. When Vince Russo strutted into WCW's creative office, he wasn't just shaking things up, he was bulldozing through traditions like a toddler with a sledgehammer and zero impulse control. Mean Gene, the consummate professional who treated wrestling like an art form, found himself starring in a nightmare that didn't come with a script. Russo's infamous idea to book Gene and Mark Madden as wrestlers was less innovative genius and more, what did I just walk into? Gene didn't mince words, calling the plan a terrible idea because, let's face it, putting an interviewer and a commentator in the ring was like asking a barista to perform brain surgery. Skills don't always translate. Russo treated wrestling like a toy box, tossing everyone into the ring and hoping something would stick. Gene, meanwhile, was the grown-up watching in horror, wondering when the grown-ups would take back control. Backstage, Gene's irritation with Russo wasn't subtle. Multiple shoot interviews reveal Gene saw Russo's booking as reckless, disrespectful to the craft, and frankly, baffling. Russo's Crash TV style clashed with Gene's old-school reverence for wrestling fundamentals, making the tension less personal and more a cultural clash between chaos and order. Gene's frustration was emblematic of many veterans' feelings during Russo's reign, watching a sacred art reduced to a chaotic mess. Russo might have thought shock value was king, but Gene knew that without respect for the business, it was just noise. And that noise grated on Gene's nerves like a scratchy record you can't turn off. Gene liked Tony Schiavone as a person, but that didn't stop him from seeing the cold reality behind the smile. Tony was the kind of guy who watched out for Tony first, and in wrestling's cutthroat jungle, that often meant stepping on whoever got in his way. Gene himself said in a 2006 RF video shoot that Tony watched out for Tony, which in backstage speak translates to being a master of self-preservation, and, if necessary, self-promotion at the expense of others. This wasn't just locker room hearsay. Tony's reputation for political backstabbing was well known among wrestling insiders, and whispered with disdain in countless backstage corridors. Gene, who valued respect and professionalism, found this attitude grating. For him, wrestling wasn't just about what happened in the ring, it was about a code of conduct backstage, something Tony regularly ignored like it was a commercial break. To Gene, Tony's every-man-for-himself hustle clashed with his ideal of shared respect and loyalty like a bad bump crashing into a well-executed suplex. Backstage, Tony was seen as a divisive figure, someone who had no qualms about burying talent or colleagues if it served his interests. Gene's frustration wasn't outright hatred, but a quiet, simmering irritation towards someone who played the politics harder than the promos. It's hard to trust a guy who's your friend when the cameras are rolling and your opponent when they're not. A classic case of two-faced backstage politics. Gene's dry humor shone through when describing Tony's style, calling him a fox guarding the henhouse who made sure the hens got the short end of the stick. It was a perfect metaphor for a guy who smiled for the fans, but quietly manipulated the locker room like a chess player who'd happily sacrifice pawns to save his king. Gene's experience with the Ultimate Warrior was like trying to have a serious conversation with a hurricane, loud, unpredictable, and impossible to understand. He called Warrior the most impossible guy to work with during interviews, which was polite wrestling speak for good luck figuring out what he's on about. Gene even admitted that when they spoke privately on the phone, he often couldn't make heads or tails of what Warrior was saying. Imagine being the calm anchor trying to decipher a cryptic poem shouted in a different language. It wasn't just the confusing speech patterns. Before SummerSlam 1991, Warrior reportedly held up Vince McMahon for money, a stunt that didn't just raise eyebrows but obliterated any backstage trust. Gene remembered this incident with a mix of disbelief and frustration. After that, Warrior's reputation backstage took a nosedive, and rightly so. Trust is the currency of wrestling, and Warrior's withdrawal was bouncing like a bad check. Backstage, Warrior was a cocktail of chaotic energy, eccentric behavior, and questionable professionalism. Gene's patience wore thin, dealing with a man whose mind seemed to operate in a different dimension. Interviews with insiders and Gene himself confirmed that working with Warrior wasn't collaboration. It was damage control, like trying to stop a speeding freight train with a wet noodle. Gene's dry wit captured the madness perfectly. Trying to follow Ultimate Warrior was like reading War and Peace in a tornado. Confusing, chaotic, and you're just praying to survive the last page without losing your mind. The Warrior's aura may have been electric, but backstage, he was the lightning rod no one wanted to get struck by. Gene's transition to WCW was less a smooth career move and more like stepping onto a sinking ship while wearing a tuxedo. WCW management, led by the ever-controversial Eric Bischoff, ran the show with the subtlety of a wrecking ball in a glass factory. Gene, a man who valued precision and professionalism, quickly found himself stuck in a world where chaos wasn't a bug, it was a feature. Backstage, WCW's management style was notorious for its micromanagement paired with reckless decision-making. Gene respected Bischoff's business savvy, but was often exasperated by how the man's hands-on approach sometimes strangled creativity and made the locker room feel like a pressure cooker ready to explode. It wasn't personal hate, more a simmering frustration with the madness unfolding around him. One insider described the environment as controlled chaos, which sounds about right if you imagine a toddler given the keys to a Ferrari. Gene, used to WWF's corporate polish and order, had to adapt fast to a place where booking decisions could flip like a coin toss and storylines changed more often than a Vegas blackjack dealer's mood. Gene's old-school professionalism clashed hard with WCW's culture of rapid-fire changes and backstage politicking. He wasn't just frustrated with the decisions, but with the way management handled the business like a high-stakes game of Jenga, pulling pieces without care and hoping the tower didn't collapse before the pay-per-view. Gene's patience was stretched thin as he navigated this unpredictable backstage maze. His dry wit summed it up best. Working under WCW management was like trying to herd cats, if the cats were all holding chainsaws. And there you have it. 5 prime examples of when Gene's patience packed its bags, left town, and sent him a postcard saying, "Don't call me." For a man who made a career out of being unflappable on camera, these grudges prove that even the calmest waters have sharks swimming underneath. Whether it was backstage politics played like a blood sport, creative decisions that looked like they were written on the back of a napkin during happy hour, or promo partners speaking in riddles only a head injury could decode, Gene wasn't afraid to silently or loudly keep receipts. His disdain for questionable management could have filled its own hotline special. And let's not forget the colleagues whose digs at his age were about as subtle as a steel chair to the head, if the steel chair was also screaming, "Boomer!" See, in wrestling, everyone eventually works themselves into a shoot. But with Gene, when the camera light turned off, the smile faded, and the truth came out quicker than a pay-per-view main event ending in a DQ. If you've enjoyed this stroll through the burned bridges of Gene's career, smash that like button like a push being killed in a booking meeting. Subscribe for more tales where the grudges are real, the quotes are sharp, and the humor is black enough to headline a funeral. And remember, in the world of wrestling journalism, we don't do kayfabe beef. We do the kind that still makes the locker room door slam decades later. Thanks for watching.